It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Donald Trump says he wants to take Greenland away from Denmark. How seriously should we take him?
People really don't even know if Denmark has any legal right to it. But if they do, they should give it up because we need it for national security. That's for the free world.
I've had enough of lessons learned, inquiries, reviews. Let's get on and take the action that is necessary to protect children.
It is, if I can put it in blunt terms, to escape the straitjacket of the traditional comprehensive school and embrace the idea of what I would call genuinely independent, non-fee paying state schools.
Tony Blair brought in academy schools over 20 years ago. Have they been a success? And it's the first Prime Minister's Questions of the year. We'll have that live from midday. Joining me today, Labour peer Shami Chakrabarti, Conservative peer Stuart Jackson, Kezia Dugdale, former Scottish Labour leader, now at Glasgow University's Centre for Public Policy, and Emily Sheffield, columnist, broadcaster and former Conservative advisor. This is Politics Live. As you saw in the headlines, President-elect Donald Trump has ramped up threats to take control of Greenland and the Panama Canal. He says it's for national security reasons. It was quite the press conference yesterday at his Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida. But on a private visit to Greenland yesterday, Donald Trump Jr. played down those fears. Let's take a look.
But just really excited to be here. Awesome country. The scenery coming in was just spectacular. So, just very excited to be here.
Do you have a message from your father?
He says hello.
Okay, to whom?
We were talking to him yesterday, so he says hello to everyone in Greenland.
Okay, are you still interested in buying Greenland or?
Thank you so much.
How seriously should we take these threats, Shami?
I really don't know. It is the truth. I hope that this is all sound and fury, and that when he is surrounded by the institutions of the US administration, the diplomatic corps and advisors and so on, that this will settle down. But yeah, it's pretty baffling. I never thought in my lifetime that I'd see, not just once but twice, a US president with so little regard for the international rules-based order that we've long associated the US with.
I mean, Stuart, he said very clearly it is for national security reasons, and he could resort to economic or even military force in terms of taking back Greenland, Panama Canal. Denmark's clearly said Greenland's not for sale, and Justin Trudeau, because he also talked about annexing Canada, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister there, says not a snowball's chance in hell. Not easy to say that, by the way. How seriously do you think these sort of demands, risks or threats should be taken?
Probably not that seriously. I think Donald Trump is ventilating a big debate about geopolitical issues. For instance, Greenland has reserves, significant mineral reserves, which are probably quite important to the United States. It's quite fashionable, I suspect, to give away territory. The Labour government is, after all, selling out the Chagos Islands to a foreign country, so perhaps it started a trend. But I mean, seriously, no, I think it's flag waving. He's not going to start a war with Denmark, but I think it is important perhaps to look at the status of Greenland as a territory of Denmark. And if we're having a debate on that, that's fine. But will there be an annexation of Denmark? Will there be an invasion? Canada. I mean, or Canada? Will it become the 51st state? No, I don't think so. Principally, Donald Trump has got many, many other bigger issues in the United States to focus on.
And what sort of debate do you think there should be about the status of Greenland?
Well, I think Greenland obviously has been the subject of territorial disputes amongst different countries in the Baltic and Scandinavian area for many, many years. And I do think if we can settle it once and for all, that Greenland is the territory of Denmark, then to me that would be a positive outcome for this debate. That's not to say I think the United States should annex Greenland, because I believe they've got no territorial integrity in terms of having ownership of Greenland. I think, you know, Trump is at the top of his game, and I think he's just really shooting the breeze, to be honest.
How do you think we should respond to what Donald Trump has said on foreign policy?
Well, the first thing is we usually expect up to one foreign policy intervention from a US president in a kind of statement like that yesterday. I think we've got 10 different things to worry about from the future president. I think we should be concerned, of course, we should be concerned about what he's saying. I think we have to be careful, though, not to overreact. So the response for the UK government should be to get close to Trump, to have a strong relationship there, to understand what he's thinking about, but also to link arms with other European neighbours that are concerned about what he might do in the event of that, and to walk alongside him.
Does it worry you?
Doesn't worry me at all. I think people hugely make the mistake, and Sharmi, I think you're really making the mistake of not looking at what is beneath, the geopolitics beneath what he's just saying. He, by the way, is not aiming this conversation at you or The Guardian or anyone else in this country. He is aiming that conversation directly at China and Russia, who are trying to expand their authority in the Arctic. And he's quite right. I'm completely behind him, trying to push back on their growing influence there.
Sure, but Denmark's an ally.
No, that's really important. Do you want China and Russia to control the Arctic, or do you want a democracy like America? Now, he's just saying these things. I might take it back. He's flag waving. Of course, he's not going to send the military into Greenland. I mean, that'd be completely ridiculous. What he is saying is warning China and Russia, be careful. I'm here now. I know how to barter. And you ain't going to get any more influence here. And we should all be cheering that.
Of course, hasn't he?
Well, look, I mean, I'll take my lessons from Emily, clearly, but I do think...
You don't have to take my lessons. I'm just saying there is another side to this argument, rather than completely going, oh, wow, every single thing Trump says is a complete outrage.
I didn't say that.
We need to look at...
Let's Shami respond.
I just said I didn't know how to decode everything that he said, and I hope that it's not all literal, But Denmark is a member of NATO, an ally of the United States. Any complex issues about claims in Greenland would be more to do with self-determination of people in Greenland, and certainly not to do, as Stuart intimated, with American claims.
Well, it's only 12 days to go until the inauguration of Donald Trump. But let's talk about this. In the Standard, Tories to seek support for new child grooming inquiry in Commons vote. We've talked about this already on Monday and Tuesday on Politics Live, but this is specifically about what's happening in Parliament later today. The Conservatives are bringing forward an amendment to Labour's Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill today, and we'll talk about the substance of that in a moment. It's calling for ministers, again, to establish a national statutory inquiry into historical child sexual exploitation, focusing on grooming gangs. Now, the Education Secretary, you heard her in the headlines, Bridget Phillipson, has said pushing for a new national inquiry into grooming gangs by halting the progress of a bill aimed at bolstering child safety is utterly sickening. Bearing in mind the numbers are straightforward, Stuart, the Tories can't win in terms of getting this vote through because of Labour's big majority. So how can you justify playing politics on such a serious and distressing issue like child sexual exploitation and abuse?
Well, I think Bridget Phillipson is gaslighting the British public, given that this government has 67 live consultations and reviews at the present time on things that are not as important as this. This is fundamentally an issue of the systemic abuse by a minority of Pakistani heritage men of thousands of white working-class women over the last 20 years, and the failure of the state, including my own party when in government and the Labour Party in government, to deal with that issue.
And you said the failure, and that's because the woman who led the national inquiry into this issue, Professor Alexis Jay, said there's no need for another inquiry. She did it. Just implement the recommendations, which, as you say, previous Conservative governments failed to do.
Well, her inquiry, published in 2022...
Sorry to break, it's not previous. A lot of that legislation is coming down the line.
Yeah,
It's
but
a complete lie put out by Labour that the government wasn't getting on with it. The government was getting on with it. That legislation is coming through.
Hang on, Emily, hang on. None of the recommendations have been implemented.
Exactly.
And
some of them are being implemented.
Yeah, but none of them had
speak.
been implemented, and there were 2 years for the government to do it.
We
all
had
I
an
will say,
election in
all
July
I'm saying,
2024.
I'll come to you in just a moment. All I will say, yeah, to Stuart, is why and how how do you justify using this particular bill to forward that inquiry?
Because it's a courageous, principled decision that Labour ministers like Jess Phillips, who should have taken, because it's in the national interest to find out why this happened, if it's still happening, who failed. And I think there should be prosecutions. There should be people prosecuted for malfeasance and misconduct in public office. People should be deported. We need to look at the criminal justice system as it affects these people. And just coming back to the Alexis J inquiry, the Alexis J inquiry was a very narrow inquiry of 6 urban locations.
No, it was a broad inquiry, but you're saying it didn't focus enough, particularly on the grooming gangs.
Towns in England where this problem was proliferating, including my own former
Well, let me come to Shami.
Yeah.
In terms of what are you saying, that nothing more can be learnt about what is a despicable issue and crime that have been committed and may still be committed?
So I'm a public lawyer, and I have called for many inquiries, and I even sat on the Leveson inquiry. So there is a place for public inquiries. There's no doubt about that. But I think there's some confusion here about what inquiries can deliver and what they actually delay. Now, my concern about, as I say, many times I've called for public inquiries when I think there's a scandal and the lid hasn't been lifted. I think the lid, to a large extent, has been lifted, and there are 20 recommendations that are yet to be implemented. My other concern is, and this happens a lot, if you have a new inquiry, it becomes a justification for delaying police investigations and prosecutions. That's happened time after time in my experience. I recently sat on a Lords committee that looked into the working of public inquiries, and one of our concerns was the length of time they take. And if we're not careful, the public will become increasingly cynical. I think I heard before your show you've got a clip. You had a clip of a woman saying, "I'm sick of all these inquiries. I want action." So I, in this instance, think we've got 20 recommendations. I heard Alexis J on the radio yesterday. I thought she was very compelling about what she thinks needs to happen in terms of action, rather than another inquiry when her recommendations have not even been implemented.
Right, Emily. I mean, you are talking about a report that was done by Alexis J. A number of years ago. If the woman who led that inquiry that took 7 years is saying, just get on with it, then surely this does look like playing politics. It's a newfound interest of the Conservative Party in grooming gangs. Well, hang on. I will come to you.
There's a grooming gang task force established.
Yeah, I heard yesterday from your Conservative colleague.
550 arrests have been made. So you should. I think you should.
Well, hang on. If you let me finish the sentence. You're so eager to come on this. Let me finish the sentence on Robert Jenrick. No, Robert Jenrick had no interest. There was nothing about a national inquiry in the election manifesto of the Conservatives. My colleague, Nick Robinson, Googled grooming gangs and Robert Jenrick, and he's made a huge fuss about a national inquiry. Nothing. So I put to you again, why the newfound interest in a national inquiry?
I think because what's happened, Robert Jenrick, by the way, was the only one who raised why Bassaran Hussein was let back out. He wrote to the parole board. He was one of the worst perpetrators of one of the worst gangs in Rochdale. He's been let out. 50%
but
of
I'm
his...
talking about the national inquiry that you're calling for.
And I'm going to come to that. I'm just saying that Robert Jenrick does have some form on this.
Well,
and
we couldn't find any of it on the national inquiry.
I'd also like to correct at this point, and you appear to be repeating this as well, the Conservative government did so much action on this. There have been a number of inquiries.
But none of the recommendations.
No, you keep going back to one report. No, I want to... Please let me speak. This recommendations, the 20 recommendations, was across child abuse, across the whole of society. There were only 7 around grooming. One of them was, which is a toolkit, which is already done. I have read all those recommendations, and I have read all the detail of what the Conservative Party then replied to them. Many of them had very good reason why they were delaying them, because, as you said, there were other inquiries going on around education. This was not a Conservative government saying, I don't want to put these recommendations in. They had very good reason. And Labour are using this as an excuse to attack a Conservative Party that has put so many of these rapists behind jail. Now, to get back to your question about whether we should have an inquiry or not, I know, but I do have to correct what is being repeated.
All right, Emily,
incorrect.
You're taking up too much time. But anyway, go on.
Should we have an inquiry? I think this should be openly discussed, because there are 50 towns and cities across this country where grooming gangs have still been operating. The very man from the Times newspaper who did more work than anyone else to uncover these grooming gangs has said himself, we have never really explored what was behind the proliferation of these gangs.
All right. Well, let me come to Kezia. I mean, that is
from the politics of it.
Well, indeed.
I'm trying
Kezia,
to. I'm one of the people who's trying to.
If I could have a chance to speak. The first thing to say is Alexis Jay did an interim report in 2018 and where some of those recommendations were stated. So this Conservative government did have longer than 2 years to implement the recommendations there. It's more like 5 in truth. And also a lot of progress has been made around prosecutions. Andrew Norfolk acknowledges that in the Times today, because the work that Keir Starmer did as the Director of Public Prosecutions. So a lot of progress has been made. Why are the Conservatives talking about this just now? Well, I think the answer to that is very clear and it's very political. If you look at evidence from British Futures, the think tank, they've demonstrated that the Conservatives lost about 55% of their vote in the recent general election to people who were particularly sceptical about immigration. Now, I think that same pool of voters are the people who are concerned about grooming gangs and are very much drawn to voting for reform again in the future. The Conservatives know they need to try and get that voter pool back. That's why they're the ones, Stuart, I'm sorry to say, that are doing the gaslighting around this issue.
Nothing to do with the Labour preponderance of Labour voters amongst the Muslim community, including in Jess Phillips' constituency, Birmingham Yardley, where she held by less than 700 votes.
There's politics.
And do you think that's why? Do you think that's why it hasn't come to the fore in the way it should have done?
Well, if we leave the politics, if we leave the politics, I would like.
Well, I'm trying to leave the politics to say there could be a cross-party consensus even now on this.
And there should be.
Because it's in everyone's interest that we understand culturally why this happens. I agree.
So I put it to you, Stuart, that if you have another public inquiry, it will delay.
Not if it's time-bound,
I'm sorry, but I do know about this area of the law, and time and again, a new public inquiry will interfere with criminal investigations and prosecutions. This happens. This is one of my concerns about having yet another
But to be fair on this inquiry,
hang on, Emily.
And we have been putting these men behind bars.
Let me just put this to both Shami and Kezia, but to you, Shami, when it comes to playing politics on this issue of child sexual exploitation, you'll remember this that was put out by the Labour Party when Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister. Labour is the party of law and order. Do you think adults convicted of sexually assaulting children should go to prison? Rishi Sunak doesn't.
That was disgraceful. We should never have put that out.
Right.
End of.
Yeah, I agree completely. It serves this issue no good whatsoever, and this is where I agree with Emily, that what we're talking about is the abuse of some of the most vulnerable children in the country. We should be committed to trying to address that. And the starting point is making sure that 20 recommendations in a report, many of which published 5 years ago by a leading academic in this area, are actually realised. Some of that will happen in a bill this week. Some of it requires a lot more work yet.
Jess Phillips said that didn't go far enough.
What does that say, though, before we move on, about Keir Starmer's judgment that went out? Under the Tories, 4,500 adults convicted of sexually assaulting children under 16 served no prison time. Labour will lock up dangerous child abusers. You say that shouldn't have gone out. But what does it say about his judgment?
Well, I don't know who signed it off. I literally am not in a position to answer on who signed it off, but I am here to say, you put that to me, no ifs, no buts. We should not be putting out material of that kind. I'm not here to throw stones at the Conservatives when they play that game and then play it myself. That's my position.
Let's talk about the substance of the bill that is going before Parliament later on today. We have a headline to show you in the Times. Schools bill is act of vandalism for education, claim the Tories. The new bill could impose national pay scales on all state schools and rip up academy freedoms that have led to excellence, say critics. We can talk to the BBC's education editor, Branwen Jeffries. Branwen, what is the bill going to mean for academies?
Well, for academies as well as all other schools, there are a couple of measures that will really interest parents. So a restriction on branded items of uniform that they can require, and all primary schools will have to introduce ultimately a free breakfast club available to all children. For academies specifically, there are measures which seek to control them centrally far more. So an obligation to follow national paying conditions for teachers. The details of that will be determined by the independent pay review body. academies will have to make sure that all the teachers they employ are fully qualified teachers. There are a tiny minority in specialist subjects at the moment that aren't, and crucially that they will have to follow the national curriculum. Now, most do already. The reason this matters is that Labour is conducting a very substantial review of what children learn, the mix of subjects. That will report in an interim report within the next couple of months and then later this year. So this is a measure to ensure that all academy schools follow that new curriculum when it's introduced.
What about the legacy of the Conservative governments from 2010 onwards in terms of school standards?
Well, one of the very interesting things about the row today is under the last government, when Nadhim Zahawi was Education Secretary, the government brought forward a schools bill which also sought to increase the powers of central government over academies to restrict their freedoms, and that proved enormously controversial and the bill was shelved. Overall, the Conservatives point to improving positions relatively in international league tables, progress made in maths, particularly in primary school and in reading. There are some things which have proved really difficult to change. The disadvantage gap widened coming out of the pandemic after substantial progress made before it. And in addition to that, there is still a significant minority of teenagers, around a third, who leave school without enough good GCSEs. And that was unchanged under the Conservatives.
Bronwyn Jeffries, thank you very much. The Conservatives talk about education being one of the things that they got right, that you got right during your time in government. We've heard a little bit from Bronwyn. What do you think the legacy is?
I think it's a great legacy. You look at the English, maths and science, we're the leading country in Western Europe now. The Academy programme, which was started under Tony Blair, was an excellent policy, gave authority and autonomy to school heads. It enabled better recruitment and retention of teachers. We strengthened the inspection regime. We started Teach First, or Labour, I think, started Teach First. We consolidated it. It was a very, very positive bi-party approach to education, and I think it's so sad that this government, for ideological reasons, is potentially wrecking that heritage for both parties. After all, it was Tony Blair in 2000 that brought forward the first substantive school legislation, and all those great things, Ofsted inspections or driving up standards in urban areas, poorer areas, are under threat because this government's in hock to the teaching unions and to local authorities. And I do think they don't have any demonstrable vision of what education is going to be like other than wrecking what's gone before.
Shami?
I think the record is more mixed than Stuart sets out, and in particular there is a whole generation of, it's not just the fault of any particular government, but remember we've got the COVID legacy, we've got a high degree of child poverty and a lot of and a mental health crisis that is prevalent even amongst children and young people. So there is we've also got concerns about homeschooling and children that disappear off registers, and they're allegedly being schooled at home, and they aren't all being safe at home, let alone schooled at home. So I think it's more complex than Stuart suggests. And again, I'm perfectly happy to have a bipartisan discussion about it, but there is considerable room for improvement.
Let's just have a look at the graph, because the figures that you talk about in terms of the international rankings, yes, you can see England there at the top, but actually, according to the Sutton Trust, it's partly due to the greater drop-off in performance in other Western European countries, including Scotland and Wales, rather than improved performance here, just to give it a bit of context in terms of the improvement, and that is for the average maths scores particularly. But the other legacy, which is partly down to the pandemic, is persistent pupil absenteeism, poor pupil mental health and a crisis in special educational needs. Do you accept that?
I think those are all problems. Special educational needs is probably the most difficult. Demographic change, because the school rolls are going to drop over the next number of years. I'm not sure, I wouldn't say use the word trust, I'm not sure the local authorities or Whitehall have the capacity to deal with those specific issues. They'll reach for the easiest solution often, which is to close a school. Whereas when you did have the academy programme, you had the capacity to drive up standards. The other thing I'm really worried about is teacher recruitment and retention. Because you had local pay and conditions, you could keep the best science teachers, physics teachers, maths teachers. Yeah. Now you've got this dead hand of Whitehall, you've got rid of disaggregated local pay and conditions, and you're going to have a very difficult situation, big strategic issues which local authorities, I don't think, are going to be able to cope with.
Kezia, why roll back the freedoms of academies?
Well, that's not what's happening. The idea that Stuart's just describing there seems to be arguing against having national pay bargaining for teachers. I'm just wondering if you would apply that to the NHS, if you would like different health boards to be able to bid to pay doctors more and then have a race to the bottom or the top in that regard when it comes to wages. I think that's a small tweak and a really welcome one, that schools wouldn't compete with each other on the wages of their teachers. Because the competition should be around standards and excellence and having specialities in particular subject areas. And I say that as someone who comes from Scotland, where we don't have free schools, we don't have academies, we still have the belief in comprehensive state school
and we've
education.
seen that by your results.
We've seen the results of that.
And I was just about to say, but the thing about that chart is all the aspects of the United Kingdom are going in the wrong direction. Right?
No. England is doing so much better
that chart
than
back up
Scotland
again.
and Wales.
The post-pandemic,
Wales governed by Labour. Scotland.
No, I'm sorry. If you put that chart
let's have a look.
again,
If we can put the graph, there you go.
Up again. Post-pandemic, all the nations of the United Kingdom are all falling.
But can we just look where Scotland and Wales are?
I agree with you. The starting point's not good, but the idea that something miraculous is happening in England under the Conservatives compared to something bad happening in Scotland and Wales is not evidenced by that chart.
But why can we take the... You're talking about taking the politics out. Why can't we just say that actually there were some great things that happened under the Conservative government in education?
I didn't argue against that.
I agree with Shami. We have not got this 100% right. No, it's like saying that, you know, we've got 100% right on child abuse. I, like Shami, actually am deeply worried, and I'm glad this bill is tackling it in some way, about home education. Yeah, I think so many pupils drop out, particularly, and it doesn't seem to be a huge amount of sort of governance over this. Why should a child not be allowed to go to school? They should be in school. Parents are not teachers. They're moved away from an arena where teachers can watch over for their well-being. Make sure they leave school with a chance in life.
Well, would you go further then on that? Because I think this is...
personally,
yeah, well,
Shami will know probably better on the law around this.
Well, I mean, there is a bit of a fine line, because it is a human right to have a significant say.
And some children do better with homeschooling.
But when you've got children, as we have seen, who are of concern to the authorities, and we're not even satisfied in their safety. They should not be...
in that horrific...
Exactly.
And
that's what this bill will do, is it will refuse homeschoolers where you have social work involvement in a family. That's a big step forward.
That's a big positive step.
The legislation is not all bad. There's some very good ideas in it.
But why do you think it's ideological? Bearing in mind, Tony Blair, as you said, introduced academies. I mean, the idea is that I think either Emily or Kezia said about what is going to improve school standards for the vast majority of people.
Well, watering down the powers of Ofsted, Jo, isn't going to, which is practically the first thing Bridget Phillipson did.
Or changing the nature of reporting so it doesn't put this chronic pressure on teachers and head teachers.
But why? Clear ideas around what because I think also what we can say again, not politicising it, but I'll just take it with the word wave Conservative, in the last 14 years, is you have got in the academies, in schools as a whole, 90% are now good or outstanding. That's up from 68% in 2010.
And is it because of them having having the independence from local authorities? Is that what has made academies successful? That they can, to some extent, emphasise their own curriculum, or that they could pay more to get ahead of science?
It was also head teacher leadership matters. So it doesn't have to be under a free school or an academy. It can be under a state school operation. The idea that head teachers are in charge of their schools, they have the resources and the localised leadership to lead for their community.
But you're not.
The evidence says that is successful.
But there has to be a balance. There has to be a balance.
Why? What is the balance? Why is it a bit back to the future?
OK, so I think there has to be a balance between school autonomy and national standards, whether that's in terms of the curriculum or whether that's in terms of how you monitor, you know. And that is a tightrope that any government should have to have to walk, because you can have a brilliant individual school that has fantastic parents who are all middle class and putting lots of effort into that school, whilst at the poor end of town that support and that resource isn't there. So there has to always be a balance, I think, between the best for the most children and
that's
creativity
exactly
and
what the
autonomy.
Academy programme did. It put the resources, it brought in...
Well, it's not being ended, is it?
Leadership. Well, it is ended because you've reduced you've scrapped the budget for moving state-supported schools into becoming academy chains. So it's obvious Labour hate academies and free schools. The situation was that where you had consistently failing schools in urban areas, in vast swathes of our country, academy chains did... There were some sticky schools, probably 2% of schools, where you couldn't do anything, whatever the governance structures. But academies did drive up lower socio-demographic groups, poorer kids and families, because of the leadership of
Shami, and then we'll move on.
I would just... The one thing that I would really take issue with in your remarks earlier was your criticism of the teaching unions, because it is not good for any government to go to war with the people who are actually working in a service, whether that is health workers or whether that is teachers. During the pandemic in particular, I think the main teaching union, the NEU, played an absolute blinder, actually digging into union funds to make sure that poorer kids at home got access to computers and to material. It's all
not in my area.
It was very patchy, I think, the evidence about who got, but you know.
What they can, and I think listen to the people working in any service as well as the people who are benefiting from it.
Let's have a look at this headline in BBC News. And in fact, just before we do that, you can now listen. I almost forgot, to Politics Live on the live news stream on BBC Sounds. Just go to the live dial at the top of the BBC Sounds homepage and tap on live news. Almost forgot to promote the programme. Let's have a look at this headline now in BBC News. 20 councillors quit Labour in Starmer protest. It's a headline from last week. We can talk to one of those councillors, Teresa Cullen, in Broxtowe. It's in Nottinghamshire, who now sits as an independent. Hello to you, Teresa. You were a Labour member for over 20 years. Why have you quit as a councillor?
So, well, I've been a Labour member for 40 years. So well over 20 years, and a councillor for 9 years. And for all of that time, I've been a very active Labour member, and I've loved being a Labour member. I've been involved in all different areas of the party and done lots of different things. And recently, in the last couple of years, things have become very difficult for us in Broxtowe, and it's been well documented, but things have become difficult in Broxtowe with us, and we've had a poor relationship with the Westminster Labour Party, and that culminated recently in us being told we could no longer challenge any policies that we found locally quite indefensible, and in doing that we would be blocked from being Labour councillors in the future.
And the policies, can you tell us of the policy you're talking about?
Well, we were the winter fuel allowance, which, you know, nobody wants wealthy people to get a winter fuel allowance, but the level, the 12,000 level was too low. You can't live well on that sort of money in the UK. You need, the cap could have been higher. The two-child benefit cap, the WASPy women, the different policies, we found that we couldn't defend them. And it just came to the point where the Labour Party were then challenging us and saying, you have to do this on our behalf. That, you know, the Labour Party's changed. Well, it has changed. It's changed well away from what the Labour Party should be, and it has always been. And it got to the point where 10 of us were blocked from being councillors in the future. I was one of them, and I've been a councillor for a while.
Well, let me... Shami Chakrabarti is one of the guests here in the studio. Shami, what do you say listening to Teresa?
I'm really sad. I'm really sad to hear that after her 40 years in the party. And I do think that whilst, of course, there has to be some discipline, and my colleagues in the government will talk about, you know, difficult economic choices and so on, but in a mass movement political party like the Labour Party, And it has to be a mass movement party if it's going to take on the Elon Musks of this world. It's not the party of wealth and power and privilege. It has to be a party of numbers. There has to be some room to breathe, and there has to be some debate. Now, of course, there has to be discipline, but sometimes, you know, again, you need a balance between discipline and healthy difference and discussion in a mass movement party.
Do you understand why Theresa quit as a Labour councillor?
I wish she hadn't. And I'm sad at that choice because part of being a mass movement party is sticking it out when you agree and when you disagree with the leadership. You know, she sounds like a very dedicated public servant, and I hope that in time she will feel able to rejoin the Labour movement.
Yeah, what do you think Keir Starmer has to do, the government has to do, to bring you back in to the fold, Theresa?
So I just want to respond to Shami and say, you know, I'm incredibly sad. I'm incredibly sad that we had to make this decision. And there have been good times and bad times being a Labour Party member over 40 years. And I've always been, you know, stick with it. We can sort this out. We can get through this. And recently, and I wouldn't have, if you'd have told me 2 years ago this was going to happen, I would not have believed it. But recently, it's become untenable. We've not been allowed to have any opinion that differed. And we've been, you know, hauled over the coals for anything that we say that isn't completely in line with the Westminster Party. And that's never, ever, ever been the case in the past.
But let me just come to Kezia. Doug, now, listening to this, I mean, Shami mentions discipline. The party has won an election, the first one since 2005, with a massive landslide. That's the price you have to pay.
Yes, it's incredibly difficult. I mean, when I was Labour leader in Scotland, I had to suspend a number of councillors in Aberdeen because they did a deal with the Conservative Party to form a coalition that was against our party rules. And I had to suspend people like your guest who had given decades worth of service to their party, and it was very difficult for everyone involved and very sad. But discipline matters. You can't operate as a party, let alone a government, by having lots of your own members speaking out against your party positions that are incredibly difficult to argue for. So there are many people in the Labour Party uncomfortable right now with two-child cap, with the position on WASPy women, on the winter fuel allowance, on Europe, which is a big one for me. But this is what it means to be part of a big party, is that collective responsibility.
Theresa?
So, Kezia, I've been through 40 years of this, and I've never, I haven't always agreed, and a lot of time I have agreed. But it's never in the past ever been the case that you weren't allowed to raise your concerns or speak out or call on the Labour government to rethink. We were always able to do that, always in the past, and not being able to do that now makes it impossible for us to defend policies with our local constituents. And whether we're allowed to stand for Labour or not, by-elections across the country are being lost because Labour taking this stance is losing its core vote. And winning a landslide election, we won that election on a lower vote. It was the Conservatives that stayed at home, not the Labour voters that came out. And we have other elections coming up, one after the other.
Right.
And it's no good winning and then losing straight away again because you make poor decisions once you've won.
I mean, is Labour, Kezia, still as broad a church as it likes to say that it is?
It's hard for me to comment on that because I've not been a member of the party for 5 years.
But you're a supporter.
Absolutely, and looking in on it, we are in a weird position just now where you have a government with a majority of 165, but it comes from a vote share of 35% on the lowest turnout in a general election in 20 years. That is a pretty tricky position to be in. So it's quite a shallow base of support that Labour has. It has to service that very carefully. And I think there is a job for Labour's front bench, actually, to work the party a bit harder, to be explaining to the party and the people like your guest who have given it decades of service, make them feel good about
We could
Labour
do with
again.
you in Westminster, Kezia.
Oh, well, you can talk about that after the programme. Theresa Cullen, thank you very much. Let me just show you this in The Guardian, Shami, because John McDonnell, former Shadow Chancellor under Jeremy Corbyn, there's a threat lurking right underneath Labour's nose, and it's from the left. Do you think that Labour has failed to look at its perhaps old traditional core vote to some extent, because obviously taking on the challenge from the Conservatives?
I read his piece, actually. It's very interesting because we are, I think all the major parties are aware of the challenge of reform and so on, but it is important to remember these other splinter groups and parties. There's this independent group now. There are breakaways at local level, as we've just discussed. The Green Party has a parliamentary foothold and so on. And you could say, well, that all adds to the gaiety of nations. But I come back to my point about in our system, traditionally, you do need to have a mass movement Labour Party. That is what, after the war, delivered the NHS. And that is ultimately, it seems to me, the way that you take on the huge, wealthy, vested interests, not just in the country, but increasingly in a very globalised world.
Well, let's go into the chamber because we've got Prime Minister's questions coming up in just 5 minutes' time, filling up nicely there before Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative leader, takes on Keir Starmer, posing his questions. And you've been notably silent, understandably, Stuart and Emily, while talking about Labour Party. Let's talk about Kemi Badenoch. How do you think she's doing, Stuart?
I think, in the circumstances, she's doing reasonably well.
What are the circumstances, having lost so much of the parliamentary party?
Yes, I mean, they've got 121, the lowest cohort of Conservative MPs in living memory, the worst election result. It was quite a reasonably bruising leadership battle. I don't think there's any imperative for her to put together a fully costed manifesto in the next 2-3 months even. But I think by the run-up to the local elections, maybe in April, May, we need to be looking at and understanding the direction that she's setting for the party and the leadership. Personally, I think the shadow cabinet should be more visible and working harder. And I do think she's actually got to be emphatic, as Blair was with his 5 pledges, on some key areas of principle that the Conservative Party will fight the election on.
Right.
Because this Labour government is incompetent, it's unprepared, it's disappointing its left-wing supporters. It always does. British politics is very splintered.
But maybe you think that's a good thing.
Well, it's,
but anyway,
it's happening on the other side as well. I mean, we lost a lot of people to reform.
You don't think she's got quite the time that perhaps she feels she does?
No, she hasn't, because if she doesn't move quickly to develop coherent policies and regain the franchise on the right of British politics, then reform could potentially eat our lunch as a party. And I think that's a big, serious threat. And she's mindful of that. She's clever, she's articulate, she's focused, but she needs to move a bit quicker.
You're nodding away in agreement. How much time do you think
I agree with literally everything you've got. Well, I think what is bearing down on us is the elections in April and May, the local elections, and activists, they need some clear pledges or clear sort of ideas which they can go and sell on the doorstep alongside local things. But that's got to be the background, that's got to be the backbone of what they go out with. And there's got to be Kemi Badenoch and what the Tory party stands for sitting on those leaflets as we go out. Because what we're seeing with Farage is he is not holding back from jumping into every single issue. They were extremely smart jumping into the Scunthorpe Steel position. That is a seat which Reform could easily gain in the next election, and I've spent a good deal of my life up in Scunthorpe, and a very good Conservative MP lost to Labour, and the party has got to develop a bit of that sort of killer instinct about winning again. It's got to excite its supporters.
I joined the Tory party 40 years ago. Believe it or not.
I know. I'm sorry, I meant to say, really, 40 years ago, yeah.
But the point being that at that time we were really energised by Margaret Thatcher, and we thought she had, whether you agree with her or not, she had vision, she had drive, she had charisma, and she looked the part. And
Kemi Badenoch hasn't?
Well, what I would say is Farage is recruiting new members because he's answering people's questions, whether you agree with him or not. And I think Kemi has to really be... It's an incredibly tough gig for her, but she's really got to show that leadership, that drive, that vision, that charisma and ambition.
And when you say the policy, you need to see a sort of shape of an outline of policy in order to blunt Nigel Farage and Reform. What about Liberal Democrats on the other side in terms of a broad church that we were talking about with Labour?
That remains a problem for all parties, actually. That remains a problem for Labour as well, is that there is this split. There's the Reform vote coming in certain areas of the country, and for the Tories and Labour, you know, the Lib Dems have taken back a huge number of seats. So it is difficult. You've got to try and flex that you're keeping the huge swathe of, let's say, Oxfordshire happy, which has now been taken over by the Lib Dems, and do that groundwork of getting councillors back on those councils, on those local councils across Oxfordshire. but you've equally got to try and keep some support up in areas like Scunthorpe,
but what policies will
which
do
in fact
that?
is still a Tory council.
But I mean,
well, core conservative values, you know, pro-business, pro-family, low taxes,
rule of law,
deregulation.
International rule of law.
Well, we don't all obsess like you, Shami, and see everything
I
through
don't
the
think
prism of international law.
No, but
because you have to get to that.
Margaret Thatcher was a supporter
Margaret
of
Thatcher would never have supported the overreach.
Maybe this is the new
First
normal,
world
this
leader to
idea
speak
that
on climate
maybe
change.
this is the new normal, that we are in a position now where Labour and the Tories will only ever surmount 60% of the vote of the British public when we'll have more political parties. And what that will take us to is the desperate need for electoral reform and to have a system that doesn't reward first past the post.
What, and reach the sort of awful sort of stasis of all these hung parliaments across Europe. I mean, I don't think so.
But
I think the British will
coalitions are-
absolutely reject that.
Well, coalitions are good things because voters get what they want as a result of that.
They're not
You
if
get-
nothing ever happens, because they're all sitting there and
I remember the days of being promised strong and stable government by the last Conservative government with a large...
I sort of agree with Kezia on this, in that I think people's political views, their cultural predispositions, their values are no longer really represented by two massive parties and a diddly little Lib Dem party.
We're going to have to go in for
disaggregated.
PMQs on that note. Thank you.
May I wish all members of this House a Happy New Year. And Mr. Speaker, our thoughts, of course, are with those affected by the recent flooding, and we thank the responders who are working hard to keep communities safe. Mr. Speaker, this week we published our elective reform plan to rebuild our NHS and end the Tory backlog. We will deliver where the previous government failed, empowering patients, boosting productivity, more care in the community and incentivising reform. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, in addition to my duties in this House. I shall have further such meetings later today.
On behalf of everyone in Southwark, and I hope the whole House, can I offer the Prime Minister condolences on the loss of his brother over Christmas? I wish everyone a Happy New Year. Last July, the public overwhelmingly backed Labour's manifesto commitment to halving violence against women and girls. Can the Prime Minister set out how today's vote on the Children's Wellbeing Bill is a crucial step to delivering that promise, to protecting children, and without the delay of an unnecessary further lengthy inquiry?
Can I thank him for his remarks about my brother and the other colleagues who've sent me remarks. Mr. Speaker, he raises a very important issue. Violence against women and girls, abuse, child sexual exploitation are sickening. Many victims have been let down for a very long time by warped ideas about community relations and the protection of institutions. Mr. Speaker, he raises the question of inquiries. There have been a number of inquiries, both national and local, including one covering Oldham, and reasonable people can agree or disagree on whether a further inquiry is necessary. This morning I met some of the victims and survivors of this scandal, and they were clear with me that they want action now, not the delay of a further inquiry. The J inquiry, the last national inquiry, was 7 years, which would take us with a further inquiry to 2031. I think action is what's required. But whatever your view, whatever anyone's view on whether a further inquiry is needed, what I find shocking is that anyone in this House would vote down the Children's Wellbeing Bill this afternoon, which is vital protections for the most vulnerable in our society. And I urge the Leader of the Opposition to withdraw her wrecking amendment.
Leader of the Opposition, can we bear
Mr. Speaker, the whole House has heard that the Prime Minister lost his brother during the Christmas period. So can I offer him, on behalf of my party, our sincerest condolences? The new year has started with a focus on the decades-long rape gang scandal. Across the country, thousands of girls were tortured and sexually abused at the hands of men who treated them as things to be used and disposed of, destroying many lives forever. The Prime Minister has mentioned previous inquiries. He is right. There has been an inquiry into child sexual abuse, but it wasn't about the rape gang scandal. In its 468 pages, it mentioned Rotherham just once. Is the Prime Minister confident that we know the full extent of rape gang activity?
Prime Minister.
Can I first thank her for her condolences, and can I thank her for reaching out over the Christmas period when I lost my brother? I really did appreciate that, and I appreciate it today. Mr. Speaker, on the question of a further inquiry, there have been a number of inquiries, some of them localised, including the Mayor of Manchester's inquiry recently, and of course a national inquiry Professor Jay carried out, took 7 years, had 20 recommendations, none of which actually were implemented by the party opposite when they were in government. Now, this is a really serious issue, and we must focus, obviously, on the victims and survivors. There's no fixed view on the victims and survivors about a further national inquiry. There are mixed views. But there is a view, and I share this view, that what is needed now is action on what we already know. We already know, myself from personal knowledge when I was Chief Prosecutor, that warped ideas, myths and stereotypes about victims were at the heart of this. We've known that for a decade. The Jay report called for mandatory reporting. I called for it 11 years ago. What we need now is action. What can't be tolerated is the idea that this afternoon members opposite will vote down a bill which protects children, include Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, let me just. One of the provisions in the bill is to protect children vulnerable today who are out of school to prevent abusers ever taking those children out of school. I implore members opposite to defy the misleading leadership of the Leader of the Opposition and vote for a really important bill.
Mr. Speaker, I'm shocked that the Prime Minister would say that actions were not taken. He knows full well that we accepted 18. He knows full well that we accepted 18 of the 20 recommendations in the Jay inquiry and went further, launching a gangs task force that found 550 more perpetrators. That shows that there is still work to be done. In Rotherham alone, there have been over 1,400 victims. Across Oldham, Bradford, Bristol, Rochdale, and dozens more towns, there have been thousands more victims, but no one has joined the dots. No one has the total picture, and it is almost certainly still going on. One victim from Telford, and I know he says that victims have different views. We have different views across this House. But one victim from Telford says she wants a national inquiry because it will hold people accountable in a way that previous inquiries have not. Correct. It is very possible to have actions, take on more, and still have a national inquiry. So why won't he listen to victims and launch a national inquiry which would have the power to summon witnesses and make them give evidence under oath?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, she says they accepted the recommendations. They didn't act on them. Exactly. One of the central recommendations was mandatory reporting, and it still hasn't been enacted. I called for this 11 years ago. They've been tweeting and talking. We've been acting. Well, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition has been an MP, I think, for 8 years. Her party have been in government for 7.5 of those 8 years. She was the Children's Minister. She was the Women's and Equalities Minister. I can't recall her once raising this issue in the House, once calling for a national inquiry. It's only in recent days she's jumped on the bandwagon. Now, Mr. Speaker, in fairness, if I'm wrong about that, and she has raised it, then I invite her to say that now, and I will happily withdraw the remark that she hasn't raised it in this House in the 8 years that she's been here until today.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is being very specific because I have raised this issue. I've raised it in speeches. I've raised it publicly. He knows that as a minister, I would not have been speaking on this specific issue. I was not a Home Office minister. But Mr. Speaker, I will remind him about other victims who came to me who I did help. The victims of the Tavistock scandal, who came to me as a minister, I didn't send them away like his safeguarding minister. I made sure, as his Labour Party were calling me transphobic, that we launched the CAS review, which even his health secretary has accepted. So we do right by victims, Mr. Speaker. The reason why a national inquiry is important is because this issue is systemic. It has been involving local and national officials, the police, prosecutors and politicians. He talks about some of the local inquiries, but these interlinked issues cannot be covered by local inquiries alone. In fact, the leaders of the Manchester inquiry resigned because they couldn't get evidence, they couldn't summon witnesses, and not a single person in a position of authority has been held to account. The Prime Minister called for 9 inquiries in the last Parliament. Does he not see that by resisting this one, people will start to worry about a cover-up?
Mr. Speaker, this is an important issue, and we have to focus on the victims and survivors, and it isn't helpful. This sort of lies and misinformation and slinging of mud doesn't help them one bit. Doesn't help one bit. Mr. Speaker, she raised a question of a victim with me, and quite right to, and I accept that victims and survivors are in different places on this. Those that I've spoken to are worried about the delay of a further inquiry. The last inquiry took 7 years. That would take us to 2031. Now, these inquiries, amongst the issues that's been raised with me, and if she's been speaking to victims, they'll have raised this with her, is that it's very hard for victims and survivors to come forward to explain what's happened to them. They do not want to be rushed through this process, which is why the last one took 7 years. It's not sensible to suggest that this can be done in a hurry, on the cheap and comprehensively. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, that would take us to, let's say, 2030, 2031. The victims that I've spoken to want action today. I agree with them on that. But what I don't understand, I genuinely don't understand, is why anybody today would vote against the Children Wellbeing Bill, which will protect children who are vulnerable today. It will kill the bill. It will stop those provisions for children exposed at risk today. I implore them, vote for the bill. Don't wreck this in this misguided way.
Mr. Speaker, it is very possible to have shorter inquiries, especially if they are covering areas that have not been looked at yet. We don't need to repeat the work that has already been done. Let's look at new areas. Former Labour MP Anne Pryor said that there were councillors and MPs all over the country who knew what was going on but were terrified of being labelled racist. A national inquiry would ask if there was a racial or cultural motivation to some of these crimes where white girls were seen, as Jack Straw said, as easy meat. The member for Rotherham was sacked from Labour's front bench for speaking out about rape gangs. Does the Prime Minister now recognise that sacking people for telling the truth creates a chilling effect that means victims aren't listened to?
Well, I'm very happy to call out anybody who hasn't acted properly in these cases. I've done it many, many times before, and it doesn't matter to me which political party they're in. I'll call them out and I will condemn them. Mr. Speaker, when I was Chief Prosecutor, I took measures to confront this head-on. The first of the mass prosecutions for an Asian gang was in Rochdale. My team came to see me. It put a number of Asian men in the dock. They wanted the green light for the first of these cases to take place. I gave that green light, but on one condition, because it came to my attention that one of the men that was going into the dock had previously been arrested but not charged. And I said, you can bring the first of these mass prosecutions, but only if you look back at the file where we weren't charged and tell me what went wrong with a report so that I can start to put it right. And that's what started the reforms I brought about. So that's the approach I took in practice, whilst others were tweeting and talking. It's the approach I would take now in any case where there's wrongdoing here. But what we've got to do now, Professor Jay has said this, we have had a number of strong findings. There are 20 on the table from Professor Jay. We've got to get on with action. Don't block it this afternoon.
Mr. Speaker, we need to focus on what this is really about. This is not about the Prime Minister's work in the CPS. And I would say very respectfully to the Prime Minister, it's not about you, it is about the victims. Be a leader, not a lawyer. We know that people were scared to tell the truth because they thought they would be called racist. If we want to stop this from ever happening again, we cannot be afraid. The Labour Party has adopted the APPG definition of Islamophobia. That same APPG report said talking about sex groomers was an example of Islamophobia. This is exactly why people are scared to tell the truth. And the lack of clarity means that innocent British Muslims are smeared by association. That is not fair, and only a national inquiry can solve this. So will the Prime Minister look again at the Labour Party's adoption of the definition of Islamophobia, its chilling effect, and rule out introducing it in government?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I will call out any aspect that has prevented anybody coming forward or any case going forward when it comes to violence against women and girls, child abuse or child sexual exploitation, as I have been doing now for the best part of 15 years. But, yes, some people will say there should be a further inquiry. But that does... I accept that, but that means all the victims and survivors who are going to give evidence need to be in a position to do so. Not all of them are. I've been speaking to them. There are some that do think they are. It will take time. All of the institutions will have to give evidence. That will take time. This will delay things till 2031 also. But we all, Mr. Speaker, we already know what the major flaws are. And my argument is we should get on with that action. And that's why we're bringing forward the bill this afternoon.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has effectively told us that he's not able to do two things at the same time. This issue of a delay is a weak excuse, and I would say to him that by refusing this inquiry, he is enabling those people who wish to smear all British Muslims based on the actions of a small minority. He is talking about distraction tactics. Let us have the truth. The Prime Minister cannot tell the House the full scale of the scandal. He doesn't want questions asked of Labour politicians who may be complicit. He won't listen to the victims. He won't listen to the victims who are calling for a national inquiry. He is making this all about a bill this afternoon. Later today, he will tell Labour MPs, including in Telford, Rochdale, Bristol, Derby, Aylesbury, Oldham, Bradford, Peterborough, Coventry, Middlesbrough, Newcastle, Ramsgate, tell all of these people to vote against a national inquiry into the gangs which have systematically gang-raped children in their constituencies. This is one of the worst scandals in British history, Mr. Speaker.
Sorry? This is a very, very important issue that does matter to the country. It matters to all our constituents. I want to make sure they can hear what's being said by the Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, this is one of the worst scandals in recent British history. But how are they going to explain to their constituents that obeying his whip is more important than doing the right thing?
She's right to say it's one of the worst scandals. It's terrible. That's why I acted on it. Her recently acquired view that it's a scandal, having spent a lot of time on social media over Christmas, not once in 8 years did she stand here and say what she's just said. Not once in 8 years. They didn't act on the recommendations. They want a national inquiry. We had a national inquiry, the J inquiry, the J report. 20 recommendations, not a single one implemented. Not a single one implemented. And she said you can do two things at once. You can't kill the bill this afternoon, wreck that bill, and protect children. There was Mr. Speaker, there was a dreadful case of Sarah Sharif that everybody will remember. This was the girl taken out of school and abused by an abuser. The bill this afternoon fixes that gap. And I know, I'm looking across, I know there are honourable members on the benches opposite who know very well that what's in this bill is necessary, that it's the right thing to do, and that would want to vote for this bill. I urge them to think twice about following this short-sighted, misguided, bandwagon-jumping approach of the non-leadership of the Leader of the Opposition. I urge them to.
Speaker, my constituent, Anne-Marie, and countless other armed forces families across Aldershot and Farnborough are living in shabby military accommodation that simply isn't good enough after 14 years of Conservative neglect. So can I welcome the Ministry of Defence plan to buy back thousands of homes in my constituency? And will the Prime Minister set out how sorting out this bad deal left behind by a past Tory government will make life better for Anne-Marie and others like her living in the home of the British Army?
Prime Minister.
Can I thank her for her question? And we all owe extraordinary debt of thanks to those who serve. Mr. Speaker, by reacquiring over 36,000 service family homes, including 1,700 in my honourable friend's constituency, we can rapidly transform substandard accommodation. The deal that we've done also saves the taxpayer around £230 million per year in rent, and of course it follows the largest pay rise for the armed forces in over 20 years. There is of course still work to do, but this is a major step forward.
We now come to the Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Red Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Happy New Year to you. And can I join others by offering my personal condolences to the Prime Minister in the loss of his brother? And can I take this opportunity to express my sadness at the passing of a much-loved member of the Liberal Democrat family, Baroness Jenny Randerson. Mr. Speaker, fixing the care crisis is urgent. For the millions of people, elderly and disabled, who are not getting the care they need, for the millions of family carers who are making huge sacrifices to fill the gap, for the NHS, where over 12,000 people are stuck in hospital beds because they can't get out of hospitals, the care is not there for them. The Prime Minister is right to say we need a cross-party approach today, but as Sir Andrew Dillot has said today, that needn't take 3 years. So will the Prime Minister please speed up this work so 2025 is the year we finally rise to the challenge of fixing care?
Prime Minister.
I thank him for raising this important issue and thank him for his condolences. Yes, it is right we need to get this right. I want a cross-party consensus on this and invite him to work with us on this, as I know he will. But it is important, and he's right to say we need some action now as well. And that is why it's important I point out the immediate action that we've taken, the £3.7 billion of additional funding in the budget for social care, another £86 million to allow 7,800 more disabled and elderly people to live more independent lives, and of course the increased carers allowance. And the way in which we've set this up is in stages so that we can act and improve as we go along, but making sure that we've got consensus for the bigger changes that may be proposed in the review. And I do invite him and members across the House to work with us on this so that we can get this right and make sure that what we put in place endures beyond just a few years. Thank you.
Red David.
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid if the government doesn't bring in these long-term social care reforms this year, their NHS reforms, this Parliament will fail. So I hope he will revisit the timetable. But moving on, Mr. Speaker, while the honourable member for Clacton may miss out on his big allowance from Elon Musk, the spectre of the richest man in the world trying to buy a British political party should give us all pause for thought. And after years of the Conservatives taking millions of pounds of Russian money, will the Prime Minister now work with us to bring in long overdue reforms of party funding so that power in this country lies with the voters and not wealthy overseas oligarchs?
I think we all had a smile on Sunday when the honourable member said how cool it was to have the support of Musk, only for Musk to say he should be removed. Just a few hours later, that's the rough and tough of politics. And of course, we're looking at the question of funding more generally.
Joseph.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I welcome the efforts this Labour government has made to reset our relationship with the European Union and to seek to remove unnecessary trade barriers. The trading links between the UK and mainland Europe are of particular importance to my constituency of Ashford. So would the Prime Minister support my efforts and those of other Kent colleagues to restore international train service to Ashford International Station that will help economic growth in my constituency, Kent, and wider South East?
Prime Minister.
Right. Thank my honourable friend for raising this question. Businesses in his constituency have been badly let down by the deal of the last government, and we, of course, are resetting and strengthening that relationship on the economy, on energy, on security to deliver the growth that we need. I know this is an issue of considerable frustration to his constituents. The decision in question, Mr. Speaker, is ultimately for Eurostar, but we are keen to see international services reinstated to Ashford as soon as possible, and I would be happy for the Rail Minister to update him on the latest discussions.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, can I begin by doing something unusual, which is to commend the Prime Minister on his earlier answers to the Leader of the Opposition and, of course, to pass on my party's condolences to him for the loss of his brother. Outside of this place, temperatures continue to plummet, energy bills continue to rise, and the winter fuel allowance has been unacceptably taken away from so many vulnerable pensioners. Now, the Prime Minister intimated prior to Christmas that he had no regrets about any of the decisions that he has taken in office. Does he understand that the public do?
Prime Minister.
I thank him for his condolences. We took some tough decisions. They led to a budget which delivered the largest settlement since devolution began to Scotland. If he thinks we should now reverse that, then he should say so. What it's done is it's given the money, so now the SNP have the money, they have the power, and no more excuses for the non-delivery that we see in Scotland. If he wants me to reverse that, he should say so.
Sam Rushworth.
Mr. Speaker. Feeling safe in your own community is among the most basic of human needs, but after 14 years of Tory cuts to Durham's frontline police and breaking the criminal justice system, too many of my constituents are victims of violence, theft and antisocial behaviour, and these crimes too often go unpunished. Now, I know the Prime Minister's had a lifelong commitment to protecting victims, so what assurances can the Prime Minister give my constituents that our new government will be tough on crime and on the causes of crime?
Mr. Speaker, he's right to raise this important issue, and I have to say, when he said there were cuts to polices and somebody said boring, I think that somebody opposite just did boring. That tells you everything you need to know about the last 14 years. He's right. We need to crack down on those committing vile acts in our communities, and that's why our plan for change puts 13,000 extra police and PCSO officers into neighbourhood policing, 3.5% real terms increase, and of course tough new respect orders. Where they lost control, we'll take back control and deliver safe and secure communities.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Dipak first opened the doors to his pharmacy in 1991, and he's been serving the Chelmsford community ever since, greeting many of his patients by name. But Dipak's business is struggling. His NHS contract no longer covers the cost of the drugs he has to dispense. For example, he's sometimes been forced to pay over 100 times more for a particular mental health drug than his contract provides. Dipak is dipping into his life savings to keep his pharmacy afloat, and I'm sure that many other pharmacists across the country are doing the same. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that no pharmacist should be forced to use their own money to keep their pharmacy viable?
Prime Minister.
Can I thank her for raising this really important and challenging case? Community pharmacists like Dipak play a vital role in our health service. And as she knows, the Department of Health and Social Care sets drug tariff prices and regularly assesses what pharmacies are reimbursed to ensure overall they're paid fairly. If she would prepare to share the details further with me, I will look and have a review by the team of the particular case that she's raised with me. Thank you.
Mark Seward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, I was honoured to accept an invitation from the European Jewish Association to go to Krakow and discuss the role of Holocaust education in tackling the rising tide of anti-Semitism across Europe. We also visited Auschwitz and Auschwitz-Birkenau, where we laid wreaths and paid tributes to the many victims of the Holocaust. Given that this month marks the 80th anniversary of the liberation of those evil places, will the Prime Minister set out what this government is doing on Holocaust education to ensure that never again means never again?
Prime Minister. Well, I thank him for raising this. Anti-Semitism is completely abhorrent and has no place whatsoever in our society. Mr. Speaker, I recently met with Jewish community leaders in Downing Street to discuss what further we can do to combat anti-Semitism, and that includes allocating £54 million for the Community Security Trust to continue their vital work, committing to building a new Holocaust Memorial and Learning Centre, and providing at least £2.2 million to continue the funding lessons from Auschwitz. And I look forward to working with others on those important proposals.
Victoria Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Businesses like Hicks in Harpenden, charities like the Hospice of St Francis in Berkhamsted, health and social care providers like the Elms Medical Practice in Harpenden, a GP, are amongst those up and down this country who are warning the government about the negative impact of the proposed changes to national insurance contributions. When will the Prime Minister heed those warnings and, at the very least, look at exemptions for health and social care providers like they have for the NHS?
Prime Minister. Thank you for raising this. Look, we had to deliver a budget to wipe the slate clean and to deliver the stable basis for our economy and at the same time repair our public services. That's why we invested £25.6 billion over 2 years in the NHS, including additional funding for GPs and for hospices. And we are taking measures to ensure that funding is there to support our vital services.
Mr. Speaker, every week I visit constituents in my Hackney South and Shoreditch constituency living in the most appalling, overcrowded social housing, some with triple bunk beds in the bedroom and the parents on a sofa bed in the living room. The nearest available property to buy would be £500,000, and it's out of the reach for these hard-working families. I really welcome our government's commitment to 1.5 million new homes. Will the Prime Minister agree that we need clear targets for the number of social housing units so that families in Hackney can live in dignity?
Prime Minister. I'm grateful to her for raising this, and she describes an appalling situation when it comes to housing, and one will be familiar to a number of MPs on both sides of the House. And that's why we will deliver the 1.5 million homes that we desperately need across the country. She's right, and the budget announced 500 million into the Affordable Homes programme, which is hugely important, 100 million of that going to the Greater London Authority. And we will also, Mr. Speaker, reform the right to buy to deliver a fairer, better value, a more sustainable scheme where long-standing tenants can buy their own home.
Andrew George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Cornwall, in the last 10 years, over £500 million has been handed to holiday homeowners through various tax loopholes, etc., whilst local families are being evicted from their homes to make way for yet more holiday homes as the housing crisis deepens and worsens. The 6 MPs in Cornwall are determined to reverse this situation and to address these issues before the end of this Parliament. Will the Prime Minister agree to meet us so we get the full backing of government and deliver first rather than second homes for the good of Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly?
Prime Minister.
I thank you for raising this. We are committed to building those 1.5 million homes, and that includes 4,500 new homes every year in Cornwall. But I do recognise the point he makes, which is that excessive concentrations of short-term lets and second homes in places like Cornwall can impact the availability and affordability of homes. That's why we'll enable councils to charge a premium on the council tax bills of second homes, abolish the furnished homes let regime and introduce a registration scheme for short-term lets. But I am happy to make sure that he and his Cornish colleagues do get the meeting they want with the Housing Minister to discuss that further.
Joyce Fenton-Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government is committed to using the criminal justice system to tackle violence against women and girls. But when an abuser can use a child custody battle to continue their abuse, as happened in the case of one of my constituents, it is clear that we need to raise the issue in the civil courts too. Will the Prime Minister please look at ending the absurd assumption that a domestic abuser's involvement in a child's life is advantageous to their welfare?
Prime Minister.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's right, Mr. Speaker. Family courts must never be a tool that domestic abusers can use to continue their appalling abuse. And that's why we're expanding the number of new Pathfinder courts to provide dedicated support to survivors and protect the welfare of children. We are reviewing the presumption of parental involvement and we'll set out our position in due course. And I'll make sure that he meets the relevant minister to discuss this further.
Christine Jolly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I associate myself with the remarks of the Liberal Democrat leader and others today? Happy New Year to everyone, but 2025 is already proving a challenge for many of my constituents. Pensioners, families, small businesses, the hospitality industry, GPs, social care, as others have said. They know that the SNP has failed to deliver for Scotland. They hear when the Prime Minister says that the Conservatives left the economy in a mess, and they know that governments make difficult decisions. But what they are asking me is, when is this government going to do something positive for them to overcome the negative impacts they're facing from the budget?
Prime Minister.
Thank you very much. Can I just address something I should have addressed to our leader, which is to express our condolences about Jenny Randerson. I apologise, I overlooked that earlier on. She raises the point about the failure of the SNP and the legacy of the Tories. And I'm proud that this Labour government delivered the largest budget settlement for Scotland since devolution. And that means, Mr. Speaker, in answer to a question, 100,000 workers in Scotland benefit from the increases from the national minimum and living wage each year. An estimated 3.2 million people in Scotland will benefit from the extension of the 5p cut in fuel duty. And it comes, of course, on top of the 125 million set up Great British Energy in Aberdeen. And it reinforces the point. They've got the powers, but a terrible record. They left a terrible legacy. We're getting on for delivering for Scotland.
Last year, this Labour government delivered justice for members of the Mine Workers Pension Scheme. 45,000 members of the similar British Coal Staff Superannuation Scheme are keen to see their £2.3 billion investment reserve returned to them, which could boost coalfield communities like mine in Cannock Chase. Will the Prime Minister meet with retired miners, trustees and coalfield MPs to discuss what could be done for BCSS members up and down the country?
Prime Minister.
Well, thank you for raising this issue. I was pleased, Mr. Speaker, that the first increased payments to Mine Workers Scheme members were made at the end of November. I do understand the strong feeling on the British Coal Staff Superannuation Scheme, which is why the Minister for Industry met the trustees last year, and we will be working with the coal staff trustees to consider their proposals once the new Mine Workers Pension Scheme arrangements have been agreed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, first of all, we had a Chancellor who embellished her CV, then we had a Transport Secretary with a fraud conviction, and now we've got an anti-corruption minister who is being investigated for corruption. Now, I know the Prime Minister likes living in free accommodation, but does he really think it's appropriate that his minister is being given free housing by the political allies of some very dubious foreign regimes?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the City Minister has acted appropriately by referring herself to the independent adviser. We brought in our new ministerial code to allow ministers to ask to establish the facts, and I'm not going to give a running commentary on that important exercise.
Tonia Antoniazzi.
The last couple of days, I wrote to the England and Wales Cricket Board regarding the upcoming game in the Championship Trophy against Afghanistan on the 26th of February. I have met with the ECB and we are calling for the game to be boycotted. I thank everybody for the support that I've had across this House and also at the other place. I also would like to thank very much the Prime Minister for his intervention with the with the International Cricket Council yesterday. But would he please agree to meet and talk to his counterparts in South Africa and Australia that they boycott the Games as well?
Mr. Speaker, there's been an appalling erosion of the rights of women and girls in Afghanistan. And we all should condemn that suppression of freedoms in the strongest terms. And that's why we provided additional aid, at least 50% of which we're going to women and girls. DCMS are in touch with the international counterparts on this issue. I welcome the England and Wales Cricket Board making strong representations to the International Cricket Council on Afghanistan's women's cricket team.
Final question, Sir Roger Gale.
We're going to leave Prime Minister's questions at that particular point. We can bring you any important developments later on in the programme. Let me introduce our guests for this part of Politics Live. The Culture Secretary, Lisa Nandy. Mims Davis for the Conservative Shadow Wales Secretary and Shadow Minister for Women. And the BBC's Chief Political Correspondent, Henry Zeffman. Welcome to all of you. Well, it was a sombre but also quite heated and at times tense Prime Minister's questions, exchanges between Kemi Badenoch and the Prime Minister, and of course understandably so, because the subject at the core of the questions of the Leader of the Opposition was about her calls repeatedly for a national inquiry, but on the subject of grooming gangs, child sexual exploitation, but particularly grooming gangs, and trying, she put it, to join the dots, she says, between grooming gangs that have been active, many of them prosecuted, in towns across the UK. They are using, the Conservatives, a parliamentary mechanism to try and force the issue of a national inquiry. It's been rejected by the Prime Minister and the government. Henry, was there any change that you detected in terms of this whole debate?
In terms of the substance, no. I mean, one reason this was such a spiky session of Prime Minister's questions is not just that this is a very serious issue, as you say, but also the two main parties now have pretty divergent positions on this very serious issue. Namely, should there be a new national inquiry into the issue of grooming gangs? Now, clearly it's a matter of live political controversy how sincere the reason that each party has their views on that is, but they are in very different places. And so that's what you saw debated at length there. I think tonally, there was a slight shift from the Prime Minister, where he repeatedly stressed that reasonable people would disagree on whether there should be an inquiry or not. That wasn't something that was necessarily present in his language when he addressed this in a very impassioned way on Monday, which was his first sort of comments after this swelled up online, mostly on Elon Musk's social media feed. So I think worth watching how the tone slightly shifted. But fundamentally, the two parties are a long way apart on the question of should there be a new inquiry.
I mean, interesting, when you refer back to Keir Starmer's response on Monday to the repeated tweets on X by Elon Musk, Jess Phillips, the minister who was the subject of the attacks, as well as the Prime Minister himself, was sitting on the front bench very close to Keir Starmer, unusually, bearing in mind she's not in the Cabinet.
Exactly. So usually at Prime Minister's questions, it's just the Cabinet who sit on the front bench in shot near the Prime Minister. It's hierarchical. So it's striking that Keir Starmer had either side of him his Deputy Angela Rayner, the Chancellor Rachel Reeves, and then next to Rachel Reeves, Jess Phillips. She's not a Cabinet Minister. That was a visual show of support.
Right. I mean, Lisa Nandy, just to come back to this issue of a national inquiry, and we can talk about the politics and the motivations in just a moment. Are you confident that there is nothing more to learn from a national inquiry that focuses specifically on grooming gangs? Because the review, the 7-year review and inquiry by Alexis Jay was looking broadly at all dreadful child sexual exploitation and abuse, and this is a part of that. Is there nothing more we can learn?
So, having worked with children and young people before I came into Parliament for a decade, including many of the girls who were groomed in Keighley and in other parts of the country, I've spent a long time dealing with this issue. In fact, this is where I first met Keir Starmer 20 years ago when he was Director of Public Prosecutions. I went to see him when we were coming across children who'd been trafficked to the UK, were being picked up by the police in cannabis factories and prosecuted rather than treating as victims. And he was the only senior figure who took that seriously, who changed the law and who made sure that we protected the children. Having been in that situation, what I can tell you is that child abuse by its very nature is hidden, and there will always be more to come out. And our message to the victims of child abuse is that the door is open. If there is more to say, if there is more to be learnt, we're determined to learn it. But what I would say to those calling for a national inquiry having been very involved in the inquiries in Greater Manchester, in Rotherham, in Doncaster, in Keighley, and the national inquiry that Theresa May rightly set up under the last government that took 7 years and looked at child abuse as a whole, including a specific strand on grooming, is that every single one of those inquiries has found the same thing. It's young girls who are not listened to, who are treated as perpetrators rather than victims, often because of their age, because they're working class, and because they're female. And systems that not only ignore them and try to belittle their claims, but when those claims come to be found to be true, systems that protect themselves rather than protect the children. That's what the J report found. 20 recommendations, which we are taking forward in the Criminal Justice Bill in spring. And I would just say to those calling for a national inquiry, it's absolutely fine and proper if you now suddenly believe that there is a need for a national inquiry. But let's not pretend that at any point over the last 14 years, anyone senior, including Kemi Badenoch, asked for a national inquiry. And let's not pretend that a single one of those recommendations were taken forward in the 2 years after the report.
Well,
reported. We've got to stop politicising this issue. It is disgraceful. And those people in the Conservative Party who are decent, who want to do the right thing, we need them to stand up now and have their voices heard, because children need action right now.
When did the Conservative Party decide that we ought to have a full national public inquiry into grooming gangs?
Well, I think Ilkley's been mentioned by Lisa and Robbie Moore. If you look at his social media, he's been calling for an inquiry.
But when did the Conservative Party decide that this was, rightly, the most important issue that needs to be discussed and needs a national public inquiry?
To follow what Lisa said, and I was very briefly the safeguarding minister, I can tell you there's some extraordinarily shocking stuff that you see comes across your desk in the Home Office there, and I was only there for a matter of weeks. And as Lisa has rightly said, whether it's the Grooming Gang Task Force under Suella Braverman or the work that Theresa May did, and she took this and indeed modern slavery incredibly seriously. So I think to try to say that the Conservative Party hasn't been on the front foot on this...
But I haven't said that. All I've asked you is when did you decide that a national inquiry was the right thing?
To try and say that we haven't taken this seriously when there is now reports of 50 towns involved.
Nobody's saying that. We're just wondering why suddenly...
Let me answer.
All right, finish. Let her... Hang on, Lisa. Let Mims finish. Let Mims finish her point.
And on the blocks before the election were actions from what Alexis Jay had said, which didn't come through the wash-up, although they are now ready to go in this new bill for the Labour Party. Well, funny enough, because we wrote it following the Alexis
But you still haven't answered when it was. Let me answer it. Right, then, go on.
When that letter went to Oldham from Jess Phillips saying that despite the executive saying, although they were tasked to do it locally, they could not do it.
Right,
And I think as the safeguarding minister, and I have a lot of respect for Jess, and I've done that job, that was a cry for help that's not been heard. Now, I know Jess Wells as also...
But you turned down a similar request when the Conservatives were in power.
But no, it was from councillors.
I said a similar request. I said it was a similar request, but you turned it down.
Let's not try and muddy the water.
Well...
This is to Jess Phillips, who, if I was back in the ministerial office...
You would have...
And I'm saying to you, and she was sitting in the room saying, Mims, why won't you do this? She would be asking a different question.
All right.
She is now not a campaigner. She is the minister, and the power's in her hands. Whether she's sitting next to the Prime Minister or not on the front bench, the power is in her hands.
Well, let me just put to both of you that actually you can call me a cynic, but it's amazing that this week back it seems to have been the intervention of the richest man in the world that has made the government speed up the process and make an announcement on one of the very important recommendations, the Prime Minister thinks the most important recommendations, on mandatory reporting of child sexual abuse, and that the Conservatives have suddenly made this front and centre a national inquiry. As I say, it may be the right or wrong thing to do, but it's only happened this week in terms of both of you. Why?
Well, we were committed to mandatory reporting since Ed Miliband was leader, which feels like a very long time ago now, for professionals, because not only is that important for children, But my experience of working with frontline professionals is that often what will happen is they'll be very nervous about what they feel is grassing up a colleague when they don't have firm evidence.
But why did it have
And
to
this
be
makes it
Elon?
crystal
Why did it
clear
have
for
to
them
be
that they have to
Elon
do it, and it makes it
Musk's
easier.
rather dramatic, let's put it that way, tweets offensive to many people in terms of the things he was calling for the Prime Minister and Jess Phillips? But why has it taken, as it looks, that intervention to spur both of you into action?
Can I be honest with you, Jo?
Yeah.
My constituents, half of them don't know who Elon Musk is, and I'm not on Twitter anymore, so I have no idea what.
So you were going to make that announcement on Monday anyway?
We have been committed to doing this for a very long time. And not just the announcement about mandatory reporting, but several of the recommendations, which also the Conservative Party accepted as well. I think for me the most depressing thing about this is that it's being driven by Twitter, and I have never seen a child being kept safe through social media. Children are kept safe by culture change, by frontline professionals who are empowered to act and know that they must act, and by governments who can work with oppositions together to make sure that we've got the right framework in place. And that's where I hope, after this very depressing week, we can get to and put children back up front.
Well, let me just
on that, if I may.
Yes, just briefly,
Jo. And as Lisa said, the Prime Minister was on this 20 years ago. Things have changed with how the media agenda is derived. We all recognise that. But nothing has changed for some of those victims and survivors who feel that there is still a truth to come out. And our job as politicians is to go where the sunlight of disinfection, of understanding this should go, and we should fear nothing. And I did not see the Prime Minister at the box today, who says that he's got a great legacy of this, stepping forward to look at what is the next step. And that I agree with our leader, with Kemi, is to say, then let's do it. There is no reason you can't do two
The next
at once.
step is this evening, and you're going to wreck it. The next step this evening is to make sure that we put measures in place that could have prevented Sarah Sharif from being murdered by her family. And you're going to wreck it. And I'll just say to you, Mims, because I think we've had a much better debate here than I've seen amongst any politicians, actually, over the last week, and I really appreciate that. But what I'll just say to you is, it's absolutely fine and right if you've changed your mind about a national inquiry. And of course, that's something that we're happy to debate. And, you know, you said Jess is a good minister. She has an open mind. She has an open door. But don't wreck this legislation this evening. We've got one chance here to really show that the political system is gripping this and taking this seriously and finally acting.
You can split this bill and some of the work, as Kemi described at the box, out. I don't think it's one or the other. But I don't think as the Shadow Minister for Women, I could say that I'm happy to do nothing at this point.
All right. Well, let me just bring
to the average.
let me just bring in Henry. Where does this go now? Because we don't know quite what's going to happen this afternoon in terms of the sort of parliamentary.
I'm happy to say
procedures.
the Conservative amendment is not going to pass.
Right.
I mean, that is the slight tension here with the wrecking thing. Obviously, in theory, if the Conservative amendment were to
But they
pass,
don't have the numbers.
And they won't have the numbers on any vote, probably, for the next 4 years. That's just the mathematical reality of what happened on July the 4th, 2024. So this amendment has been proposed, and the government rebuttal about the wrecking amendment comes in the knowledge that the government is going to win the vote tonight. One of the interesting things is that Neil O'Brien, who's the Conservative Shadow Education Minister, and it is actually an education debate this afternoon, said if this doesn't pass, they will try again and again and again. So that is one place this goes.
And the title of the bill is Children's Wellbeing.
Yes,
and
schools'
you know,
wellbeing.
with this at front and centre in the first Prime Minister's questions.
But you know it's not going to get. But you know it's not going to get
do we
anywhere.
sit on our hands for the next 4 years saying, well, parliamentary process doesn't suit us, when we're talking about victims of young children and women who are being trafficked and used?
Instead, what you're going to do, according to Neil O'Brien, who's your front bench spokesperson, is you're going to try and delay and delay and delay this legislation that could have saved a young girl from being killed. I don't understand the logic.
And this is part of the bill which is looking at things like home education and homeschooling.
We have prosecuted 500 more people, found more victims, 4,000 protected. And I think in the reality, people want to see that this is being tackled.
Right, well, on that note, actually...
Political correctness has held things back for far too long, and therefore they want people stepping forward.
Yes, political correctness. I mean, you have been in power before the Labour government won in July for 14 years.
Some of the the legislation some of the things that are being delayed, as you said, because of the change in government. It wasn't that we weren't going to do it. No. And remember, many of these criminal justice bills, and Henry will know that, and others listening and watching, you know, voting constantly, Labour, about stronger sentences.
Do you mean that political correctness held you back from taking action? Because you were in government for 14 years.
No, not us, but I think Westminster shying away. Clearly, the links that we can see with
that's
50 towns now in the frame. 50 towns now.
You were the safeguarding minister. I genuinely don't get it. Well, I think you're absolutely right to say that we shouldn't shy away from the fact that Asian men are overrepresented in street grooming gangs, just like white men are overrepresented in
try not to talk over each other.
Sorry, I'm just. We're not shying away. It's you shying away.
I've heard you say that, but I just genuinely puzzled about where you're coming from. If political correctness held the Tory government back from acting, that is an astonishing thing to admit.
No, I think it's Simon Danchuk and others,
if what you're
former
saying
Labour MPs who said that they
could I
were
just
shying
get a word in?
Mims,
I do think this is genuinely important.
And Lisa, don't talk over each
one
other.
of the recommendations that Alexis J found and other inquiries have found is that one of the things that stopped action from happening was the ethnicity of the perpetrators. Just as white men are overrepresented in online grooming, Asian men were overrepresented in street grooming gangs. And it's really important that we tackle that. And I agree with you on that, but I just don't understand this argument that it's held us back from action.
Well, can I pick... Right, well, let me pick up on this political correctness language, because some of the language used by Kemi Badenoch today in her exchanges was quite striking. Talk of, you know, a potential, or it may look a perception of cover-up, and also alluding to political correctness having or stopping now the government doing anything about a national inquiry into grooming gangs.
Yeah, that cover-up language, especially notable. Another point at which she suggested that it may well be suggested that the government doesn't want another inquiry because it might expose things that Labour politicians, I think she was talking about local Labour politicians rather than national Labour politicians, had done. I mean, look, it is factually true that some of the local inquiries have exposed deficiencies from councillors, but nevertheless, that will have been taken not especially well by some of the Labour politicians opposite. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting, as you asked earlier, where this is going to go, just a few minutes before Prime Minister's questions, Kemi Badenoch released on that site again, X, formerly known as Twitter, a video of her talking about this. She launched a petition that the Conservative Party is encouraging people to sign, calling for a new national inquiry. So I don't think this is going to be one of those PMQ sessions where we talk about it this week and then next week we're talking about something completely different. I think this is now, perhaps for the first time actually under Kemi Badenoch's leadership of the Conservative Party, you can say, OK, this is a cause that she is putting at the heart of her agenda.
And if we were so afraid of the last 14 years and our actions, why is it us calling for the inquiry?
But why weren't you
We're
doing
not
it then?
afraid of it.
But you didn't... But hang on, I'm just going to interrupt because some of the accusations of politicising this extremely distressing issue stretch back to this, which we showed earlier in the programme, Lisa. You'll remember it, the Labour Party, when Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister. Labour is the party of law and order. Do you think adults convicted of sexually assaulting children should go to prison? Rishi Sunak doesn't. Were you proud of that advert at the time?
Well, I stand by the accusation that we made, which was that the Conservative government was watering down provisions that would have enabled us to hold perpetrators to account and standing in the way of progress.
Right. Well, then what do you make of this, which has been released by the Conservatives? Keir Starmer doesn't think victims of rape gangs deserve answers. We do. Do you think there should be an inquiry into rape gangs? Keir Starmer doesn't.
Well, I think it's absolutely right to say that we don't think there should be another inquiry. We think that, unlike the last Conservative government, we should get on with implementing the recommendations that have been made repeatedly by repeated inquiries, including those commissioned under them. I don't think it's right to say at all that we don't take this seriously, and that is what I think is so disgraceful. I just cast my mind back to 20 years ago, sitting in that room with Keir Starmer, who was then the Director of Public Prosecutions. I think I was 25 years old at the time. He took the meeting, unlike any other senior member of the establishment, and he overruled his own officials in that meeting to say we are going to act. He was commended. He was commended by the journalist who uncovered Brotherhood what was happening in Rotherham, who's commended by the Alexis J report. And so to say that he doesn't care is doing a real disservice to those young girls and boys
Let me just
who have
put to
systematically been raped and groomed and let down by the system.
Well, Mimsy,
because they have champions and they will continue to have a champion in this Labour government.
Conservatives were outraged by the first tweet, the advert about Rishi Sunak. And now the Conservatives are mirroring exactly that to attack Keir Starmer. Is this the sort of politics?
There were certain politicians at the time that said that attack ad didn't go far enough. So
why are you doing the same?
I think what is at the heart of this, and let's go back again to the women and girls and those people in those towns, 50 of them now, and this has changed. Let's not talk about as if we knew what's going on, because the reality is people are saying we don't know now exactly what's going on.
Well, Alexis J said we did know what was going on.
Yeah, but things have changed again now, and that's the point that Kemi's coming to. What are we going to say? What we've done something previously, so we're not going to go and look at it. Our record is there, the Labour record's there, Starmer's record's there. Let's put the disinfectant on it and do it for those women and girls who will be worried in their beds tonight.
But let's also take some action, because it's been too long. Like you're right,
I know you can keep talking about it, and they
long.
probably will, but I'm afraid it's the end of the show. It's all we've got time for today, but thank you to all of my guests for joining me for this part of Politics Live. Bye.